By the year 2142, the world was a graveyard, a sprawling, silent monument to a time when humanity had dared to touch the stars and in its hubris had fallen back to Earth in a blaze of fire and regret. This was not a world of gleaming chrome and soaring cybernetics, but one of rust, dust, and decay. The great cities of the past were skeletal remains, their towers like broken teeth gnashing at a perpetually gray sky. The oceans had soured, their shores choked with the toxic runoff of 100 forgotten wars and 1,000 careless industries. Humanity, the species that had once claimed dominion over the planet, was now just another endangered animal, its numbers dwindling, its future a sterile, fading twilight. And in this graveyard, Warlord Kaelen was its grinning undertaker. He had not built this ruin, but he had perfected it. He had risen from a chaos not with a vision for the future, but with an insatiable appetite for the present. His conquest was absolute, his cruelty a language spoken with brutal fluency from the rust-eaten, skeletal towers of old Chicago, where wind whistled through empty skyscrapers like a constant, mournful sigh, to the toxic, sludge-choked shores of what was once California, where the sun set in a sickly orange haze over a dead sea. Kaelen's armies, a horde of the desperate and the damned, had swept across the fractured continent, not to unite, but to dominate. His law was the law of the scavenger. What could be taken was his by right. But his greatest prize wasn't a city, a territory, or some forgotten piece of pre-fall technology. It wasn't a stockpile of water or a functioning fusion core. It was a person, a living, breathing miracle in a world that had forgotten them. The last fertile woman on Earth. In a world dying of its own sterility, she was the only one who could offer it a tomorrow. And Kaelen had taken her. Her name was Elara. Before the warlord soldiers had smashed down the door of her secluded enclave, her life had been one of quiet purpose, a fragile existence dedicated to preserving the seeds and stories of the old world. She was not a queen or a warrior. She was a botanist and a historian, her hands as comfortable in the soil of her hidden greenhouse as they were tracing the faded lines of an ancient map. Her fertility was a secret she carried with a mixture of hope and terror, a candle flame in a hurricane. When she was found, that candle was nearly extinguished. When she was dragged through the dust behind Kaelen's war machine, caked in grime and bound in iron, it was supposed to be a symbol of his total power over the ashes of civilization. Her capture, broadcast on every flickering screen and proclaimed by criers in every settlement, was meant to be the final, crushing word in the long, sad story of human despair. She was to be the warlord's broodmare, her children the foundation of a dynasty built on the bones of the old world. Her subjugation was the death of hope, made public. But in the forgotten corners of the dust, in the quiet, overlooked places where the warlord's gaze did not fall, something was stirring. In the skeletal ruins of a city library, in the climate-controlled silence of a subterranean archive, in the echoing darkness of a collapsed transit tunnel, a different story was being written. The descendants of history's unsung heroes, the quiet dissenters, the stubborn truth-tellers, the selfless protectors, had watched the broadcast. They had seen the chains and the dust and the warlord's sneering triumph. But they saw something else, too. They saw a catalyst. They saw a mistake. From this scattered fellowship of scavengers, librarians, and forgotten soldiers, a rebellion, improbable and desperate, was about to catch fire. Kaelen ruled from the Shard, a monolithic tower of twisted steel and scavenged glass that tore at the sky above the husk of what was once Denver. It was an architectural obscenity, a monument to pure ego, its peak perpetually wreathed in the toxic smog the city exhaled. From its highest levels, Kaelen could look down upon his kingdom of decay and believe himself a god. His law was brutally simple. If he wanted it, he took it. Resources, territory, lives, loyalty, it was all his for the taking. And what he wanted more than anything was a legacy. With humanity fading into a sterile twilight, a slow, quiet extinction brought on by the very weapons that had won the last great wars, Elara represented the future itself. She was not just a woman. She was a biological key, and he was determined to own the lock. Her public procession was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a meticulously planned spectacle of despair. Chained to a crude, rumbling chariot fashioned from the shell of an ancient military transport, she was paraded through the sprawling, desperate settlements that clung to the base of the Shard like barnacles. This was not a swift journey. It was a slow, grinding tour of subjugation. Every day, The chariot would stop in the central plaza of another slum, another shantytown pieced together from scrap metal and crumbling concrete. Elara would be displayed, a silent figure in rags, while Kaelen's heralds proclaimed the dawn of a new age under their master's virile leadership. Every person who saw her, their faces gaunt with hunger and coated in dust, was meant to see the definitive death of hope. They were meant to see Kaelen's physical ownership of tomorrow. And for most, the spectacle worked. They saw the chains, they heard the proclamations, and they lowered their eyes, the last embers of defiance dying in their hearts. Most of them did, but not all. Watching from the shattered, glassless window of a skeletal public library on the outskirts of the city, a scavenger named Marcus saw something different. He was a creature of the ruins, lean and sharp-eyed, his life a constant calculus of risk and reward. His ancestors weren't kings or generals. They were people like Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer who, in 1983, saw a report of incoming American missiles and chose to trust his gut over the protocol, correctly identifying it as a system malfunction and single-handedly preventing a retaliatory nuclear launch. That legacy of seeing the flaw in the machine, of questioning the official story, ran deep in Marcus's blood. While others saw a display of overwhelming force, Marcus, a master of patterns and logistics, saw a complex operation. He didn't see a broken prize being paraded. He saw a strategic asset being moved across a chessboard. He tracked the route, noted the guard rotations, the refueling stops, the predictable timing. And as he watched, he started to notice the cracks in the warlord's spectacle. A flicker of insubordination in a soldier's eyes, a supply truck lagging behind the main convoy, a section of the route that passed through a notoriously unstable, rubble-choked district. He saw vulnerability. Miles away, in a hidden bunker buried deep beneath the ruins of a university campus, Anya maintained the archive. She was a librarian, the last in a direct line of knowledge keepers stretching all the way back to the librarians of Alexandria, a lineage that had survived fires, floods, and wars by smuggling and preserving the written word. Her more recent ancestors were rebels of the mind, pioneers like Jonas Salk, who developed the polio vaccine and, instead of patenting it for immense personal wealth, gave it to the world for free. That was Anya's creed. Knowledge was not a commodity to be owned, but a legacy to be shared. Her archive was a sanctuary of climate-controlled silence, filled not just with books, but with servers holding the ghosts of human achievement, literature, science, music, and most importantly, the complete, uncorrupted human genome sequence. To her, Elara wasn't just the last fertile woman. She was a living library of unique human genetics, a priceless repository of biological information that had survived the plague of sterility. The thought of Kaelen, a brutish warlord who burned books for fuel, seizing that genetic heritage and twisting it into a dynasty built on ignorance and violence was an obscenity she could not stomach. Her horror was not just moral, it was academic. It was the ultimate act of vandalism. And deep below the shattered streets, in the echoing, damp darkness of a collapsed subway station that the locals called the Iron Catacombs, Jax trained a ghost battalion. He was a former commander from Kaelen's own elite army, the Blackguard, cast out and marked for death for refusing a direct order to execute a group of unarmed civilians during the brutal Salt Lake campaign. He was a descendant of men like Desmond Doss, the combat medic and conscientious objector, who, during the Battle of Okinawa, ran repeatedly into the hell of Hacksaw Ridge without a weapon, saving 75 wounded men under a storm of enemy fire. Jax embodied that same paradoxical spirit, a master of violence who fought only to protect. In the 5 years since his exile, he had gathered other exiles, deserters, and survivors, molding them into a small, brutally effective fighting force. They were the Phantoms. Jax knew Kaelen's tactics, his formations, his communications, his entire playbook of fear. He saw Elara's capture not as an ending, but as the one event he had been waiting for. It was the catalyst, the one act of hubris, so profound it could finally unite the scattered, terrified pockets of dissent across the wasteland. He saw a target, a scavenger who saw the flaw in the plan, a librarian who saw the desecration of knowledge, a soldier who saw the opportunity for a killing blow. They had never met. They were strangers, separated by miles of ruin, and united by the same silent, desperate conviction that had begun to curdle in their guts. The sight of Elara being dragged through the dust was the spark. Kaelen thought he was snuffing out the last light of hope. Instead, he had just lit the fuse on a bomb he didn't even know was there. The connection began not with a grand proclamation, but with a whisper of static. It started with Marcus. In his endless, meticulous scavenging, He wasn't just looking for food or parts. He was hunting for ghosts, for the echoes of the world that was. In the sub-basement of a defunct pre-fall corporate communications hub, a building picked clean by Kaelen's tech scrapers, he found a miracle. Behind a false wall, tangled in a rat's nest of dead fiber-optic cables, was a server rack humming with faint warmth. It was a hardened, encrypted mesh network node, an experimental military project abandoned decades before the fall, designed to operate independently and draw phantom power from the ambient radiation in the air. It was obsolete, forgotten, invisible to Kaelen's patrols. For Marcus, it was a lifeline to a world he thought was gone forever. He spent weeks coaxing it back to life, a process of digital necromancy. He jury-rigged a power supply from a dozen scavenged solar panels, replaced fried capacitors with components stripped from old radios, and painstakingly wrote code on a cracked, grimy datapad to bridge the ancient protocols with his own makeshift systems. Finally, after countless failures, he sent out a blind whisper of data, a simple, repeating query packet, a digital "Is anyone out there?" into the vast, silent dark of the dead net. One of those whispers, traveling along forgotten conduits buried deep beneath the earth, found Anya. Her archive, built within the reinforced confines of a Cold War-era continuity of government bunker, was itself a node on this ancient network, a digital island she had long believed was cut off forever. When Marcus's anomalous signal blinked onto one of her diagnostic monitors, a single, unexpected light in a sea of red error codes, she almost dismissed it as a ghost in the machine, a data echo from a dead system. But her instincts, honed by a lifetime spent sifting truth from noise, told her it was real. With trembling hands, she responded. Her fingers, usually so careful and precise as they handled brittle manuscripts, flew across her keyboard with a frantic energy she hadn't felt in years. She wove a web of counter-encryption and security protocols around their tiny new connection, a digital fortress to protect their impossible conversation from any listening ears. Their first exchanges were cautious, a series of cryptographic handshakes. Once trust was established, Anya opened the floodgates. She fed Marcus data, pre-fall satellite maps of the city, detailed architectural schematics of its infrastructure, geological surveys of the subterranean landscape. She gave him eyes in the sky, a ghost's view of a world he only knew from the ground. Marcus, in turn, provided the living, breathing context. He cross-referenced her information with his own obsessive, ground-level surveillance of Elara's parade. He mapped the guards' patrol routes, their communication frequencies, their shift changes. Together, they found it. Staring at an overlay of the procession's route and an old municipal waterworks blueprint, they saw the flaw Kaelen's strategists had missed. Elara's route wasn't random. It was designed for maximum psychological impact, passing through the most populated sectors. But for a half-mile stretch, it passed directly over a section of the city's primary storm drain aqueduct, a massive, subterranean river built to last 1,000 years. It was a section Anya's blueprints showed was still structurally sound. A system that, according to the schematics, had a service junction that led directly into the underlevels of Kaelen's fortress, the Shard itself. They had a way in. An impossible, suicidal, beautiful way in. Now they needed a weapon. A plan was useless without the means to execute it. Digging through her archives, sifting through terabytes of military records, Anya found scattered, heavily redacted reports of a rogue Blackguard unit known as the Phantoms and their disgraced, brilliant leader, Jax. The official record painted him as a traitor and a madman. But Anya read between the lines, cross-referencing the reports with civilian testimonies she had also preserved. She saw the truth. He wasn't a traitor, he was a man of principle. She and Marcus crafted another message, a new whisper, into the dark. This time, it wasn't a question. It was a lure baited with tactical intel, specific call signs, patrol vulnerabilities, and a piece of code that could temporarily disable Kaelen's internal comms, information that only a former high-ranking officer of the Blackguard would know was real. The message filtered down through a network of sympathizers and found its way to the Iron Catacombs, delivered on a scavenged data chip. Jax was deeply skeptical. Rebellions in the wasteland were born and died in days, usually ending with a line of bodies hanging from a ruined overpass. Hope was a dangerous, often fatal, indulgence. But the data was flawless. The source was unknown, but the intelligence was undeniable. And the plan was insane. It was audacious. It wasn't just about freeing a captive, it was about doing it in a way that would shatter Kaelen's aura of invincibility. It was a plan that appealed to the strategist in him, the part that longed for a worthy battle. Their first coordinated move was a disaster. Jax needed to verify the aqueduct entrance. Anya had the maps, Marcus had the visual, but Jax needed eyes on the ground. A courier, a young man from the settlements named Finn, was dispatched carrying a data slate from Marcus to one of Jax's scouts hidden near the aqueduct's location. The slate held encrypted reconnaissance photos and timing data. But Finn was caught in a random security sweep, a patrol that wasn't on Marcus's carefully constructed schedule. Cornered in an alley, with blackguard soldiers closing in, Finn made a choice. He smashed the slate against a wall, and just before they tackled him, he swallowed the tiny, diamond-hard memory chip. They executed him on the spot, but he saved the network. His sacrifice was a brutal, sobering reminder of the razor's edge they were walking. It solidified their resolve, burning away their caution. They couldn't operate in shadows and whispers anymore. This had to be a single, decisive, all-or-nothing gamble. Kaelen, oblivious, had made their decision for them. He announced a grand ceremony to take place in 1 week, a unification rite where he would publicly claim Elara as his consort, solidifying his dynasty. The event was to be his crowning achievement, broadcast on every screen in the territory, a mandatory spectacle for every subject. Marcus, Anya, and Jax saw the real opportunity. Kaelen was handing them his entire audience on a silver platter. They weren't just going to rescue a woman from a fortress. They were going to hijack the broadcast. They were going to steal the Warlord's stage, his cameras, and his people. They were going to show the wasteland not the coronation of a god, but the swift, bloody fall of a man. The night of the unification rite was thick with a manufactured tension that Kaelen himself had orchestrated. The Grand Plaza at the foot of the Shard was packed with thousands of people herded in from the surrounding settlements, their faces illuminated by the cold, flickering glow of massive broadcast screens. The air smelled of ozone, sweat, and fear. Kaelen stood on a grand, elevated dais, a figure of imposing arrogance in black armor. Beside him, Elara was chained to a gilded throne, a silent, defiant figure whose stillness was a stark contrast to the Warlord's preening. Kaelen was delivering a gloating speech, his voice booming from speakers across the plaza, a sermon of power and destiny. He was the future, he proclaimed. He was salvation. He held hope itself in his hand. This was the moment. Beneath the plaza, in the cavernous, rumbling darkness of the aqueduct, Jax and his 5-person team stood waist-deep in cold, rushing water. They were a study in focused intensity, their faces smeared with grime, their weapons checked and ready. At the precise second that Marcus's chronometer, synchronized across their hidden network, hit 0, they planted the charge. The explosion was not a boom, but a deafening crack. A circular section of the plaza's ferrocrete floor blew upwards, and from the smoking hole, Jax and his phantoms erupted like vengeful spirits from the underworld, landing in a spray of dust and debris right in the middle of the plaza. They weren't there for a prolonged battle. They were a scalpel, not a sword. Flashbang and smoke grenades arced through the air, their blinding flashes and thick plumes of smoke turning the organized plaza into a vortex of chaos. The crowd screamed and surged. Kaelen's blackguard, trained for static defense and firing lines, were thrown into disarray. The Phantom's movements were precise, brutal, and economical. They weren't fighting the army, they were ghosts moving through it, a blur of targeted violence. Their only objective, the dais. At the exact same instant, miles away in the darkened shell of a ruined skyscraper overlooking the city, Marcus slammed his hand down on a crude, heavy-duty switch. A ripple of detonations, small and precisely timed, tore through the city's decrepit power grid along pathways he had mapped from Anya's schematics. Lights across the plaza flickered and died. The secondary screens, broadcasting Kaelen's face to the outer settlements, went dark. Panic, real and visceral, began to ripple through the crowd as Kaelen's perfectly constructed stage began to literally crumble around him. But the masterstroke belonged to Anya. Deep in her bunker, she was engaged in a silent, frantic war. As the Phantoms fought their way toward the dais, she unleashed a torrent of data, a logic bomb she and Marcus had designed into the core of Kaelen's broadcast network. Kaelen's technicians, safe in a control room within the Shard, saw their systems overload. For a heart-stopping second, the main screen behind the dais, the one showing Kaelen's magnified, gloating face, fizzled to static. Then a new image appeared. It was a live feed from a high-resolution microdrone that Marcus had deployed, now hovering amidst the chaos. It showed a ground-level view, the people's view. It showed Jax's commandos not as faceless terrorists, but as disciplined soldiers moving with purpose, avoiding civilians, targeting only the Black Guard. It showed Kaelen's elite guard not as invincible warriors, but as confused, disorganized men firing blindly into their own smoke. It showed the truth. On the dais, Kaelen's tirade had faltered into stunned silence. His personal guards, panicked by the assault from impossible direction, moved to form a protective ring, but it was too late. Jax vaulted onto the stage, a whirlwind of black combat gear. There was no epic duel, no exchange of witty remarks. The warlord, stripped of his guards, his audience, and his spectacle, was just a man. A shocked, sputtering man in ornate armor. Jax disarmed him with a single cold, efficient sequence of movements that spoke of years of repressed fury. Kaelen stumbled backward, falling at the foot of the throne he had built for Elara. Jax didn't use a key to free her. He raised his combat knife, and with a single, powerful blow, shattered the central link of her chains. The sound of the breaking metal was as loud and final as a gunshot. And on the screens all across the wasteland, the people saw it. They saw their tyrant brought to his knees. They saw the chains shatter. They saw the last hope of humanity rise to her feet, not as a prize, but as a person. And then Anya switched the feed. Elara's face, smudged with dirt but illuminated by a fire that Kaelen had unwittingly stoked, filled the screens. She looked directly into the drone's lens and into the eyes of thousands. She didn't talk about revenge or war. She spoke about a future, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the lingering chaos. She talked about the knowledge saved by the librarians, a legacy of truth that could not be burned. She talked about the courage of forgotten soldiers who fought not for glory, but for the person next to them. She talked about the ingenuity of scavengers who could find life and possibility in the ruins of the old world. She spoke not as a symbol, but as a leader, a synthesizer of the very hopes Kaelen had tried to extinguish. Hope is not a thing to be owned, she declared, her voice ringing with a strength no one, least of all her, knew she possessed. Is not a relic to be locked away, or a prize to be won. Is a thing you build. With your hands. With your minds. With your courage. Tonight, we did not tear something down. Tonight, we laid the first stone. Kaelen's power was never in his army. It was in the myth that he was inevitable, that resistance was futile. And in one night, a scavenger, a librarian, and a soldier had turned his own myth, his own stage, his own broadcast against him. The rebellion was no longer a secret whispered in the dark. It had a voice. It had a face. The world was still a graveyard, but for the first time in a generation, beneath the cold, hard soil, something new was starting to grow. This story is a reminder that the most profound changes, the revolutions that reshape the world, often come not from the centers of power, but from the forgotten margins. They are sparked by the people you would least expect, armed with nothing but conviction and a refusal to accept the end of the story. If you enjoy stories about finding hope in the dark and the unbreakable spirit of rebellion against impossible odds, make sure to subscribe for more tales of courage and ingenuity. And let us know in the comments, in a world like this, what kind of unsung hero would you be? The keeper of knowledge, the builder of connections, or the protector of the innocent? The fight was far from over. A broken tyrant is still a dangerous animal, and you don't rebuild a world in a single day. Kaelen's empire, though cracked, had not yet crumbled. But the unification rite was the turning point. It was the moment humanity, as a collective, stopped staring at the ashes of the past and finally started looking toward the horizon. It proved that real legends aren't born from titles or power, but are willed into existence by the extraordinary courage of ordinary people who refuse to be forgotten. A new and uncertain chapter for humanity had begun, not with the proclamation of a warlord, but with the shattering of a chain.